University of Texas comes in at number 4 in the preseason AP poll. Dalton Wasserman from Pro Football Focus here.
You are Locked On Longhorns, your daily podcast on the Texas Longhorns. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Locked On Longhorns, the show. Jonathan Davis and Lacey Butler, your host. Today's episode of Locked On Longhorns brought to you by Pro Football Focus, but also brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more as playoffs wind down. Sports stop sporting like we want them to, but this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com today to get started. Once again, Texas comes in at number 4 in the AP poll. We're discussing the Cedric Baxter injury and discussing some of the biggest games on the Texas Longhorns schedule. All of that and more on today's episode of Locked On Longhorns, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So once again, I've mentioned it, 2 times already. Dalton, Texas comes in at number 4 in the preseason AP poll behind Georgia, Ohio State, and Oregon. What are your thoughts on Texas being the number 4 team in the country heading into their first game on August 31st against?
I think it's about right, to be honest with you. I think the top 3 for me are those exact same 3 in Georgia, Ohio State, and Oregon. And I think the 4 and 5 spots for me are a debate between Texas and Ole Miss. And I totally get it with Texas being the team in the playoff last year, one more completed pass being away from a national title run. Lost some weapons on offense, but you got some really good new ones. You've got Isaiah Bond and Silas Bolden and Amari Nyblack and all these guys that Steve Sarkisian brought in the transfer portal. So I think they're still going to be really, really good on offense and every bit deserving of that number 4 ranking. I think it's about right.
So you said that you think it's about right at number 4. Obviously Georgia, I think, their talent and what they've accomplished over the last couple of years speaks for themselves. Ohio State and Oregon, what advantages do you think they have over the University of Texas?
So I think Ohio State, the big one, that they're the easier one. The big one for me is their defense. They brought back a lot of NFL level talent on defense. I think they're at least one of the 3 best defenses in the country, and I can't quite put Texas that high until we see, especially some of these new transfers, and hopefully they get better in the secondary. Guys like Andrew Makuba kind of helping out on the back end there. But Ohio State, I think, has a big advantage on defense. Guys like Jack Sawyer, guys like Caleb Downs, who came in there from Alabama, maybe the best safety in the country. They're loaded with NFL talent. I think Oregon's very similarly built to Texas. That's a more interesting debate. Their offensive lines, probably the 2 best pass protecting teams in the country. I think there's a little more that now with CJ Baxter's injury. Oregon's a little more stable at running back with a guy like Jordan James, and they've got a good crew behind them. And, and we've seen Dylan Gabriel and Quinn Ewers get into duels before. So it wouldn't shock me if we saw the 2 of them in a playoff matchup. It's a little closer with Oregon, but I think especially with Tej Johnson and some guys that remain there for the weaponry, as opposed to Texas needing new guys to come in and build new chemistry with Quinn, they get a slight advantage for me over Texas.
So it's interesting because, the number 2 and number 3 teams are both in the Big Ten, right? And they're going to play each other this year, maybe twice, right? And then the number 1 and number 4 teams are both in the SEC, and they're going to play each other, once, maybe twice throughout the season. How do you see just right now, early on, those matchups going? Georgia and Texas and Ohio State?
I think Ohio State, Oregon in the Big Ten is incredibly interesting, especially because the game is at Oregon. And Ohio State probably has the advantage over Oregon in a lot of other spots other than quarterback, right? Where Oregon pretty clearly has the best quarterback in the Big Ten in Dylan Gabriel, right? And that's going to be the question all year with Ohio State is, can Will Howard or maybe a freshman like Julian Sayin go in there and balance everything out and give them the quarterback they need for a national title run? I still think Georgia is the best team in the SEC. I think it's going to be a tougher matchup. The biggest thing is that Texas can pass protect, and Georgia's pass rush is probably the weakest part of its team. But you've just got, Georgia, they lost 1 game to Alabama in the SEC title game last year. And otherwise, we're just dominant. They'll have to adjust to life offensively without Brock Bowers, but they've always got new weapons coming. I think Georgia's pretty clearly, to me, the number 1 team in the country and well deserving of that. If they were playing Texas today, I would probably pick them, but that's why they play the games.
That's certainly why they play the games. You mentioned Georgia without Brock Bowers, but also without Ladd McConkey as well. Do you think that Carson Beck can lead a dynamic offense losing 2 NFL players
Yeah, I do. I mean, you still got guys like Dominic Lovett in there, Oscar Delp in there. They brought in another really good tight end in Ben Urasek, who's coming off an injury, but he was excellent for 3 years at Stanford. And I think bringing Trevor Etienne into the backfield gives them, I think, a more dynamic presence in the backfield than anybody they had last year. And they're always loaded with running backs, but Etienne behind Georgia's offensive line can be really, really good. And even that, too, you have a pocket quarterback like Carson Beck, right? And they have elite pass protection, too. Guys like Tate Ratledge and Dylan Fairchild, that might be the best guard combo in the country. So I think everything for Carson Beck is really stable. The one thing I'd be concerned about is maybe do they have that number one type of guy like it looks like Texas has in Isaiah Bond? Are they going to find that? Is Dominic Lovett going to turn into that guy? We just saw Ra Thomas got kicked off the team for off-field stuff. So they're looking for that number one weapon. But I think Beck is able to manage games well enough to get him wins every single week. Wins every single.
Yeah, for sure. That's an interesting point. You talked about, Georgia and Texas being the, top two teams in the SEC. And I think Alabama is number 5 and then Ole Miss is number 6. What are your thoughts about Alabama going into?
Alabama's interesting because you still have, I think the biggest thing that Kalen DeBoer was able to do was get Jalen Milroe to stay, right? We know he's an elite dual threat playmaker. So the two things that they have stable on the field are really the two things that you need desperately. You've got Milroe at quarterback, and you've got arguably 1 through 5 the best offensive line in the country. Their interior with Booker and Roberts and Brailsford, that might be the best interior 3 in the country. And then there's still pretty set a guy like Caden Proctor, who left to Iowa and then came back. He was in the transfer portal twice, but their offensive line is nasty. The one big question for me for Alabama is actually at wide receiver. You lose Isaiah Bond, right? I don't think they have – I think their top 3 receivers combined for less than 900 yards last year. Brought over Jeremy Bernard with Kalen DeBoer from Washington, but he was really the 4th option there for the Huskies. So I have questions for Alabama at wide receiver for sure, especially. But the quarterback, the offensive line, the head coach, they're going to find a way to score, even if it's a little more run heavy than DeBoer had at Washington.
For sure. It's definitely going to be interesting to watch Alabama this year. Looking at the Heisman odds provided by FanDuel, I just checked them this morning. They have Dylan Gabriel at plus 700 to win the Heisman. He's the favorite right now. Carson Beck plus 750. Quinn Ewers, a little distance between him and Carson Beck at plus 1,000. What are your thoughts on Dylan Gabriel being the favorite right now, and then there being a distinct, distance between Dylan Gabriel, Carson?
Yeah, I think Gabriel. I think he makes sense as the favorite, right? He's had 5 spectacular years in college football between UCF and Oklahoma. Puts up big numbers every year. He was our 3rd highest graded quarterback last year, and Beck was 5th. Ewers was a little bit behind them even in our grading last season, but Gabriel has the potential. He may be on the highest scoring team in college football. They're just a loaded offense, the best pass protecting team in the country. Tej Johnson, Evan Stewart, who they got in from Texas A&M, Jordan James at running back, 2 good tight ends. Oregon's just absolutely loaded. And Beck, I think it's more he's the quarterback on the number 1 team in the country, right? I don't think they're as loaded offensively as Oregon is, or even as Texas is, to be honest. You could argue Texas's weapons over Georgia's right now if Ewers can find the chemistry with guys like Bond and Bolden and those guys. But Beck, it's kind of that best player on the best team theory, right? And if Georgia's going to be the best team, it's going to be a lot because of Carson Beck. I think the fact that Ewers being behind them a little bit, he's a little less consistently high end than those guys, right? And we've seen it. The 2 Alabama games he's played, it's been spectacular. There's other moments where he's spectacular, but is he going to be spectacular week to week? Because for the most part, for especially his 2 years at Oklahoma, Dylan Gabriel's been that, and Carson Beck was terrific every week last season, really up until the Alabama game.
For sure. Good stuff. A quick word from our sponsors, and then we're going to get into Dalton talking about the Cedric Baxter injury and how that could affect the Texas Longhorns this season. Today's episode of Locked On Longhorns brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. All right, bringing my guy Dalton back in. Obviously, just sad news seeing Cedric Baxter hurt. I'm actually going to, pivot a little bit and ask you. We saw Cedric Baxter hurt for the Texas Longhorns, and then Reuben Owens got hurt for, Texas A&M, the top two running backs in the 2023 class, both expected to miss the season. Which team do you think will feel the effects more of losing their?
I think Texas A&M. We've seen. I think they're going to be hurting more from that, even though their top two returning rushers come back, but they need to find some sort of juice in that run game because it's their top two returning rushers. But I don't think either of them had more than 600 yards last year. So A&M needs all the weapons that they can get because they're still kind of unproven. Whereas Texas, they've proven they're a running back factory, right? You got guys like Bijan Robinson and Jonathan Brooks and all these guys they've had coming through the last half decade where, Baxter was going to be one of those guys. But I think one of the things that does give you hope is a guy like Jaden Blue, right, who last year played very well in limited opportunities, over an 80 rushing grade for us, which is very good. He had a 100-yard game against Texas Tech. Blue is a guy who can fill at least some of that void. But I think for Texas, look, it's they were in a similar situation last year, right, where Baxter was supposed to be the starter, and then Jonathan Brooks steps in there, and he's great, and he ended up a second-round pick. So, I think, too, Steve Sarkisian's play calling is so good, and the way he designs his offense and the RPO game and all of that, it's really running back friendly. That's the best way. And it's quarterback friendly too. And I'm sure we'll get into that, but it's very running back friendly. There's times where it's just zone one cut and these guys can use their instincts to run. So I'm curious how much production now Jaden Blue can give them. And even true freshman guys, right? Like Jarrett Gibson and Christian Clark, guys like that who can step in and get an opportunity behind a spectacular offensive line and for a spectacular play caller.
So it sounds like, based on what I'm hearing, you think that the ceiling of this football team is still very high. You still think that with the running back rotation of, the main guys, Jaden Blue and Trey Wisner, this still can be a conference championship and a national championship contender, even with the loss of a five-star guy like.
Yeah, I do. I think, look, to me, the questions I have about Texas are not on the offensive side of the ball at all. Steve Sarkisian's one of the game's best play callers. You've got at least a top 10 quarterback, if not a top 5 quarterback in the country in Quinn Ewers. And they're going to find a way. They're going to find ways to run the ball, right? And one of the big things with Texas and the way they run the ball is they create space with formations and motions and RPO and just all of the different options that they have. So it's not just about being loaded at running back. It's look, any back in the country would love to run behind Kelvin Banks Jr. there at left tackle, right? Guys like that. That is really the foundation, their offensive line, their play calling, and then Quinn just managing everything around that because you see it. You see linebackers going in all different directions. Sarkisian is one of the game's best play callers. He creates space for his backs, and that's really the biggest reason for their success on top of their talent.
Yeah, you mentioned that offensive line, and obviously, the Texas offensive line led by, Kelvin Banks is certainly a Joe Moore Award contender. When you look at that group this year, how do you think they stack up amongst some of the other offensive lines in the country? Because, now, you lose a talent like Cedric Baxter, and that offensive line is just going to have to be a little bit better.
I think they still stack up incredibly well. And even Banks himself has, he can do a better job being even more consistent in the run game. We see times where he's mauling guys, and then there's other times if he cuts down on the mistakes, honestly, he could challenge LSU's Will Campbell for the top offensive tackle spot next year's draft. So, look, they've got a great group. They were the second best pass protecting unit in the Power 5 last year behind Oregon, certainly in the Joe Moore Award conversation. Absolutely. It's a great unit with terrific talent, excellent pass protectors. Really, really good, especially in the zone game and run blocking, man. They're really the reason that the Baxter injury won't hurt as much. It still hurts because Baxter's really talented. But to have those 5 guys, I could argue that's really the best part of your offense. And that's despite having a big-name quarterback and some big-name weapons out there. Those 5 guys, as for a lot of great teams, even teams like Georgia and Alabama, and all those teams, most of the teams at the very top in the top 10 of these rankings have really, really good offensive lines. And we know it correlates to success, right? And Texas having that really is also what gives you hope that they can compete every single week in the SEC because they're really, really good in the trenches.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely going to be a really good offensive line this year. And like I said, they're going to have to show up and show out. We talked about Quinn Ewers, right? You lose a running back like Cedric Baxter, and I would imagine it puts a little bit more pressure on your quarterback, right? So how much, more pressure, if any, do you think the loss of Cedric Baxter puts on Quinn Ewers and his passing off?
Honestly, I don't think a whole lot because I think Steve Sarkisian does a great job of taking pressure off of Ewers anyway with the way he calls plays and the way he runs his offense. I think any added pressure on Ewers comes from making the Final Four last year and being that close to a trophy and now just increased expectations for the fact that he's coming back and we're in the SEC and we can go and do it again and win a national title. I don't think the Baxter injury adds anything to that. I think Steve Sarkisian's going to expect the other running backs to come in there and play well, just like Jonathan Brooks did last year, just like C.J. Baxter himself did last year, right, when Brooks went down. So I think it's a team that's used to this. I don't think it adds pressure for Ewers. The added pressure for Ewers to me is just preseason expectation and how close they were to a national title game and maybe a national title trophy last season.
All right, so I have to ask you because you said, Texas has, a top 5 to top 10, quarterback in the country. So where do you, just roughly, where do you view, Ewers in terms of ranking quarterbacks, in the country, or who are your top 5?
I think I'm trying to remember. I had a pretty clear top 6. I believe Carson Beck was 1, Dylan Gabriel 2. I'm a Shedeur Sanders guy. I'm all about it. When he's protected, he's spectacular. I had Shedeur Sanders at 3, and this is not for like draft stuff. We're talking just college production this season. So Sanders, I had 3, and then I think I have a ranking coming out of every Power 5 quarterback coming soon. I'm trying to memorize what I had for that, but I believe I had Quinn Ewers 4, and then maybe Jalen Milroe and Jackson Dart. I know those were the first 6, and I solidly had Ewers in the top 6, somewhere between 4 and 6 I had him. I think it was number 4. But no, I think considering the pass protection, the play calling, everything he's got around him, he could have a big, big season. He just has to bring the high end a little more often. So top 6 for me for sure, along with some other really, really elite guys who put up huge numbers and really good offenses. And Ewers and Jackson Dart, I think, are really intriguing. And obviously 4 of the top 6 in the SEC. So it's going to be a lot of fun to see some shootouts in the SEC.
Yeah, for sure. It sounds like kind of Max Chadwick was saying the same thing. I think, maybe Pro Football Focus, obviously you're all in the same meetings and you host a show with them. Is the biggest thing for Quinn Ewers this year that you're looking for, the biggest thing that can maybe take him from 4 to possibly 1 on your list is just that consistency week in and week out? Or is there something else tangibly that he could improve on this year that you could, move him up the ranks, right? Is there something tangible?
Yeah, no, I think it really is. It's kind of the same way the fans feel like, at least some of them, is it's like, where can we see that guy that we've seen in the 2 Alabama games more often, right? Because he's very consistently solid. He's really safe with the football. I believe he only had 8 turnover-worthy plays all year last year, which is spectacular, right? He doesn't give the football away. He certainly doesn't lose you games, right? Even the Washington game, Penix may have outdueled him, but they didn't lose that game because of Quinn Ewers. So it's like, he doesn't lose you games, but is there more often where we can just see that guy, the guy who was the number 1 quarterback recruit in the country and tearing up Alabama and throwing Russell Wilson moonballs to Adonai Mitchell and things like, because he could do it with Isaiah Bond. Honestly, Bond, I don't know if he's as fast as Xavier Worthy, but it's close. He's a blazer, man. But they've got enough talent around him. It's that. There's moments. It's like Quinn Ewers is such a big moments guy where it's like, man, there's times I want to believe he's the best quarterback in the country, but I just don't see it often enough. It's really, sometimes our stuff, people think, oh, we're like constantly different and there's this big perception that we know a bunch of stuff. Sometimes it's exactly what the fans are thinking. And it's just like, man, we just want to see Superman Quinn Ewers more often like we do against Alabama.
Yeah, hopefully we will that season. Speaking of, seeing more of Quinn Ewers, last year, crunching up the numbers, Texas was 53% run, 47% pass on the season. Obviously, some of that accounts for, having big leads, running the ball a lot at the end of the game. But we know Steve Sarkisian, his bread and butter, is the power run game, right? And so now you lose a player like Cedric Baxter, and most fans would think, okay, we're going to pass the ball more, even though you talked about those talented runners like Jaden Blue, Trey Wisner, and then the two true freshmen. Like I said, last year, 53% run, 47% pass. Do you see those splits staying about the same this season, or do you see it maybe closer 55-45 or even 60-40?
I don't think it's going to change a whole lot. Maybe it depends on how much more Sarkisian wants to get into the drop back game with Ewers. But I think something that we have to remember with those percentages now, with the way the RPO game works, right? When you have teams with high RPO offenses like Texas, they're, I believe, in the top 5 or 10 last year in RPO usage. Any play could be anything, right? So it's not necessarily even always Sarkisian's choice of whether something ends up as a run or a pass. And if you run a high percentage of RPO, well, then it depends on Ewers and the defensive look. So it's dicey to look at percentages of like that with such a high RPO team, but I would expect it to say relatively similar, right? I think we've seen throughout the last few years with Steve Sarkisian, he wants to run the ball. That 50-50 is probably about where he wants to sit. Again, if the running game is faltering or if the backs aren't getting the job done, then yes, you have to adjust. But I think early on, I wouldn't expect to see a whole lot of change in that. It's all based on the run game, the action, and the RPO. And I would say at least 20 to 25% of their offense, really, and it's a lot when you think about what could change those percentages, is just what Ewers sees at the line of scrimmage pre and post snap, right? So it's not going to be a whole lot different. I don't think it's going to be the same. It's going to be the same kind of style where it's like, okay, we want to make our RPO game work, and then we want to take shots with speed downfield.
Yeah, that's a very good point about, the RPOs. And, that's why you work at Pro Football Focus. And that's why we bring y'all on the show, right? A quick word from the sponsors. And then we get into some of the big games for Texas on the schedule this year: Michigan, Oklahoma, and Texas A&M. Today's episode of Locked On Longhorns also brought to you by FanDuel. I love sports. I love them so much. I never want them to stop. But as the playoffs wind down, we get fewer games and the sports stop sporting like we want them to. FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime I'm in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com. Start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. All right, Dalton Wasserman back on the show from Pro Football Focus. Less than a month away from the Michigan game, probably the most intriguing non-conference game on the college football schedule this season. Texas is a top 5 team going into Ann Arbor, defending champions. Michigan Wolverines coming in at 9 in the preseason poll, I believe. How do you think these two teams match up against each other currently going into the season when they're both probably going to blow the...
It's an incredibly fun matchup, honestly. And the first thing I look at is Texas's offensive line that we've already talked about against Michigan's defensive line, which might still be the best in the country, with monsters on the interior like Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant, then a really good player off the edge and Josiah Stewart. They're just loaded on the defensive line. That's going to be a fun matchup to watch. And I'll tell you what, you mentioned it might be the most intriguing non-con game on the whole college schedule. This week I've been kind of going through all the schedule and breaking down who I think is going to win each conference and do this and that. And I found that game may really be the most consequential one, even though it's so early, to both of those teams' playoff chances, and even every team in the Big Ten and SEC's playoff chances. It's a massive, massive game. But look, we talk about Sarkisian and Ewers and this elite offense that the Longhorns have. Michigan, they lost Jim Harbaugh and a lot of pieces in J.J. McCarthy, but they're another one. I think they're still a top 3 defense in the country. You've got probably possibly 2 first-round defensive tackles, first-round corner for sure, and Will Johnson, probably the best corner in the country. They're absolutely loaded still on defenses, and their defense, especially in the big house, is going to keep them in every game. That's the side of the ball with the superstar talent on both sides that I want to see.
Yeah, for sure. That's going to be a very interesting matchup. I think that, Texas you're going to try to come in there and play some type of version of 7-on-7 where, you're going to see Michigan, kind of lean more towards that ground and pound. What style do you think has the advantage?
That's a hard one because the fun one for me is how much can Texas get to the run game? This may be the game where they really, really needed CJ Baxter, right? And one of the things that we have on Quinn Ewers is there's a big split between his success in play action situations and non-play action situations, right? So for us, his play action passing grade last year was over a 90, which is an elite number, right? It's one of the best marks in the country. And in non-play action, it's a 71, which creeps closer to average or slightly above average, right? So what I think Michigan is going to do is load up and just not let him run the football. Right. And obviously it's tough because Texas offensive line and Kelvin Banks and those guys are really good. They may be one of the few teams that's able to block Michigan on a decent basis. Right. But I think they're going to make Quinn Ewers beat him, and he's going to have to make big throws. Those times, this is the exact moment when we talk about I need Superman Quinn Ewers. I need the Quinn Ewers that we saw against Alabama twice. I'm going to need him in this Michigan game, especially on the road, because I'm sitting here believing that Michigan's not going to let them get the two-way go on them, right? To let them run the ball, to get the whole RPO game going. I think it's going to be press man. I think they're going to make Ewers beat him downfield, and it's going to be on him to make it happen. It's going to be on him to make it happen.
Yeah, for sure. That's a really interesting point. Last question. I'm going to get you out of here, Dalton. Texas has two of the biggest rivalry games in college football this year, both ranked in the preseason poll, Oklahoma and Texas A&M, just a little bit further down than Texas, just a little bit. Who do you think has a better chance? I'm assuming Texas is going to come into both of those games favored. Who do you think has a better chance to beat the Texas Longhorns this year? Texas A&M in Kyle Field or Oklahoma in a neutral?
Well, first, how fun is it that we get to see Texas versus Texas A&M in conference again with everything on the line? So that'll be a fun one. But honestly, I think Oklahoma, I do. Obviously, we saw Oklahoma beat them last year, and now Dylan Gabriel's gone, and they've got Jackson Arnold and like a brand new offensive line in there. But you have to like the middle of their defense, Danny Stutzman, Billy Bowman, guys like that. And that just seems to be the rivalry that, outside of a here and there, it's always tight. I would almost expect another game like last year, unless Oklahoma's offensive line has issues early in the season. I think Oklahoma is better than Texas A&M. Texas A&M was the one team that kind of puzzled me as far as being number 20 in the country. And look, there's a lot of hype on Connor Wegman. They've got a new coach, but we're going to find out a lot about them early. They played Notre Dame at home in their first week, but either way, it's going to be an obstacle. Going to Kyle Field's always an obstacle, especially for Texas, with it being your last game of the regular season. But I think Oklahoma's the better of the two. I think Texas will be favored more so over A&M than Oklahoma, and rightfully so.
Dalton, a lot of gems today. As always, Pro Football Focus brings it, at a high level when they come on Locked On Longhorns. Let them know where they can find you and they can get more of your amazing content and amazing comment.
So we've got a ton of written content at pff.com, and you mentioned Max Chadwick. He and myself host the PFF College Football Show, where we'll be breaking down especially game previews and reviews all season long. We've got our playoff and awards predictions coming very, very soon, so check that out. Like and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. And, we're going to have a lot of fun this year, especially with a 12-team playoff on there for sure.
Yeah, hopefully Texas has a lot of fun this year hoisting that national championship trophy at the end, right? Hook 'em. Peace.
Oh, we're getting there.